All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Kaikala. I'm the Executive Director of Washington Business Week. Thank you so much for joining our conversation of our speaker series on international business. Today I have with me on the panelist frames, I have our board member, Alyssa Norwood from Starbucks, and I have Dr. Jenna Lusk, our Director of Operations of Washington Business Week. We also have Dave, who I will be introducing here shortly, but want to do some housekeeping first. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but if things come up for you and you want to ask those in real time so you don't forget, go ahead and type those in the chat box or the question and answer, and we will get to them again at the end of the presentation. We're looking forward to a dialogue with you. And so now it is time for me to introduce our speaker, Dave Versteeg. He is the Chief Financial Officer, International and Channel Development for Starbucks. He is a proud graduate of Washington Business Week and of the UW Foster School of Business. He has been with Starbucks for almost 16 years, and he speaks multiple languages, of course, English, German, Japanese, and Mandarin. Take it away, Dave. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrea, very much, and thank you, Alyssa, for inviting me to share a little bit about international business and about Starbucks today. I want to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about a few things. I have a feeling that there's some of you out there who may be interested in a career in international business, so I want to just sort of share my story for a little bit and see if it might give you something to think about, or maybe some questions that you might have about starting off in a career in international business. And then secondly, get into a little bit about Starbucks and what we do and how we go about our growth in the international side of the business. So first, just to introduce myself, again, as Andrea said, my name is Dave Versteeg, and I am the CFO for Starbucks International and Channel Development, which means that I help look after most all of our retail stores outside of North and South America, across Asia, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then channel development at Starbucks refers to all of the things that we sell that you would see in grocery stores. So you may have seen our cold brew coffee, our bottled Frappuccino, our creamers that we sell in the grocery store dairy aisle, things like that. That's what we call channel development. So also help look after that part of the business, which is also very large in the US, but a global business as well. We sell those products all around the world. So thank you again for joining, everybody, and really excited to talk to you all today. A little bit more about my background. Let me just start off by talking a bit about my career journey, which really began very close to home. I'm from Seattle, and grew up in Burien, which is just in the south part of Seattle, and went to Highline High School. I'm a proud Highline Pirate, and maybe some of you out there are at Highline or watching from Highline as well. And I think my high school experience is relevant for a number of reasons. Number one, I grew up in Seattle, which I didn't have the beginnings that you would think would be of somebody who's going to start a career in international business. I wasn't really exposed to a lot of diversity as I grew up in high school. It was Washington and Seattle were a much less diverse place than they are today, back when I was growing up. And so as I got toward the end of my high school career, I really started to explore the rest of the world and see what was out there outside of Seattle and outside of Washington State. A couple other components from high school that really became helpful as I went into college were I took German language. As Andrea mentioned, I speak a little bit of German and have worked in Germany. And I think I'll talk about this story a little bit later, but what really sparked my interest in international business was just the fact that I took German in high school. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then secondly, I also went to Business Week, as Andrea mentioned in the beginning. I attended Business Week the summer after my junior year in high school. And it not only sparked an interest in business for me, but also just really was one of the first times I'd met a lot of really interesting people outside of my own sphere of friends. And really, believe it or not, 30 years later, I have a lot of thankfulness for Business Week and what it provided me as a high school student. After that, I went to the University of Washington. I'm a proud Husky and studied accounting. And then serendipitously, a few other things that I got into at Washington were studying sociology and a little bit of international business. And so by the time I got to college, I sort of had an interest in the international business world, but again, at the same time, had no idea I'd be embarking on a career there. After college, I graduated with an accounting degree and went to work at Deloitte, which is a big accounting firm here in Seattle. My original goal was to work on some international clients that Deloitte had. They're well known for having lots of international clients around the Seattle area. But funny story, when I went to work there, I quickly learned that the boss who was in charge of most of those international clients was a really hardworking guy, and he liked his staff to work lots of long hours, and I wasn't really interested in doing that. So at that point, I decided to turn my attention elsewhere and focused on some hometown clients here in Seattle, and that's where I got my first exposure to Starbucks. I worked with them as a client when I was at Deloitte. So then fast forwarding to going to work at Starbucks. And let me just stop here, and if anybody in the audience, any students out there or non-students, if you've ever worked at Starbucks, let me know in the, I'm using the Zoom webinar chat function. Let me know if you've ever worked at Starbucks, and maybe share a story or two as we go through the next few slides. So at Starbucks, I started again in the finance department coming out of Deloitte, and quickly realized that I had over time developed a real love of international travel. And so I set out with an objective of trying to combine a couple of things, you know, my love of travel as well as my career. And so that's really what got me started down the path I'm on today at Starbucks. And as Andrea mentioned, I've been here for about 15 years. The reason I tell you about my background is, you know, really just to emphasize a couple of things. You know, number one is, for those of you who are in high school today, I started out really just like you, a high school student in Seattle with not a lot of multicultural background, not a lot of travel experience, but had a couple experiences through learning a language, through attending Business Week, and then eventually traveling in Europe when I was in college. That really sparked an interest in me in international business. And that's a little bit about how I've gotten to where I am today. Okay, let me talk a little bit about my international journey. And I have a reflection question here. Also, if you're interested, let's take a little trip together. And in the chat, if anybody has taken a trip recently, which you probably haven't gone very far, but think about what is the most interesting place you visited recently. It could be another country, could be another neighborhood around where you live. Just in your mind as we go through the next few minutes, think about an interesting place you've been. The photo on this slide, if you don't know, is actually a coffee farm. I think it's in Central America, and this is what coffee farming looks like. Coffee grows on coffee trees, which are small, as you can see, and the woman in the picture is harvesting coffee cherries. For me, one of the most interesting places I've been is actually a coffee growing community, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So let me talk about my international journey. Starting on the bottom left, again, you know, starting in high school and into the University of Washington, my interest in international really began when I backpacked around Europe after my junior year in college. I have a picture of the Parthenon here, and I remember distinctly one of the highlights of my trip was when I saw the Parthenon in person in Greece. And I remember thinking to myself that this was a building that I had studied a lot about when I was in high school. And I was actually seeing it in person, and it had a very real sense to me. It sort of brought the broader world into my view to realize that these things that I had studied about and seen in books for the last 20 years were real things that I could actually go out and touch and visit. And that was a very powerful moment for me, just realizing how big the world really was and how much was out there outside of Seattle, Washington. The second picture on the left side of the three boys is some kids in a country called East Timor. And East Timor is in Indonesia. I had a chance to visit there many years ago when I had a friend there in the Peace Corps. And he was in East Timor for 2 years. And at the time I was there, East Timor was the poorest country in the world. It had recently gained independence from Indonesia and was still finding its footing. And most of the economy in East Timor is based around coffee farming. It's the largest export of the country is coffee. And so I was able to actually live with a family that my friend was living with and experience the life of a coffee farmer. And that wasn't really my intention, but I learned a couple of things. Number one, I learned an appreciation for coffee farming, and it's really carried forward to what I do today, and how difficult of a life that is, and how coffee farming in East Timor is very similar to how it is in Africa and Central America and other places around the world where coffee is farmed. Secondly, I started to learn about international cultures, and this was the first time I'd really had a chance to live with a family in a foreign country, and I got to see how people lived and how different life was. And again, this really just opened my mind to what different lifestyles and different cultures people had around the world. My third big international adventure in the upper left was to Germany. And as I mentioned, I took German in high school. And when I got to Starbucks, I just luckily filled out an employee survey that asked about, what sort of skills do you have and what are your interests? And I wrote down on the survey that I took German in high school. And I sort of fudged a little bit how much German I knew and said that I was pretty good at speaking German. Really, I was probably kindergarten level, but it came time a couple years later where Starbucks needed somebody to go to Germany to help out with our business there. And because I knew a little bit of German from my high school days, I was picked to go over there, and that was really the start of my international career. What I learned in Germany was I started to learn about business culture in foreign countries and how different it can be from business culture in the United States. In Germany, for example, people in the company at Starbucks and in the office I worked in were extremely professional. Meetings always started right on time. And that was different from the US, where we typically started meetings 5 to 10 minutes late. And then the feedback I got when I first got to Germany from the CEO of the company was that my desk was too messy. And it was very important to him that my desk be very, very clean, because that's how he liked it. And that's very important in German office culture. So as a finance leader, I was surprised to see that what he was focused on was not the dollars and cents, but on how clean my desk was. And that was just very, very important in that culture. My next assignment was in China, and I got the opportunity to work in Shanghai for just over a year as Starbucks was growing its business in China. I was there about 10 years ago, and in China, Starbucks had 200 stores across the whole country in China. Today, we have over 4,000, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but China has been a phenomenal growth market for Starbucks. And one that was a very exciting place to work for me earlier in my career. There I continued to develop my sense of business culture in foreign countries. And not surprisingly, business culture in China was very different from business culture in Germany and the United States. In China, I would describe it as very pragmatic. When people I worked with in China saw an opportunity, they went after it in a big way. And they didn't let anything get in their way, and they're very interested in growing their business. And so today you can kind of see that in Starbucks, where, like I said, we've grown from 200 stores to over 4,000 in just over 10 years. And then finally, most recently on the upper right, I have just returned from a 3-year assignment working in Japan as CFO of our Japan market. And Japan, I had the pleasure of working there for 3 years. So by far my longest international assignment. And so I got to learn a little bit more probably about Japan than in other markets. But what I learned about in Japan that was somewhat new was this idea of a very strong national culture. In places like the United States and China and East Timor and Indonesia, those countries are made up of, traditionally different pockets of people that have very different cultures, very different languages, and have come together as one country. In Japan, the population in Japan has a long tradition. It's a diverse population, but it's also got a lot of very national and wide national traditions and a national language. And it was very interesting to see how that culture permeated into the business side of things. A couple examples there that I found interesting and maybe didn't even realize at the time. But number one is in the office environment, most office employees in Japan wear similar things. It's a very sort of conformist culture. And so I found that when I went to work in Japan, my wardrobe quickly changed, and the things that I wore, the clothes that I wore in Seattle, they didn't really come across. The bright colors, the logos that were on my shirts, they didn't really work well in a Japanese office environment. And so I found my wardrobe changing without me even knowing it. And then secondly, I think the other thing that was really, really interesting in Japan was just the overall work culture and the position of work and employment in the national culture. In Japan, as you may know, it's got a reputation for people working very, very hard, rarely taking vacations, and working very, very long hours. And I think that's somewhat true, but when you dig underneath it, it's got a very interesting background where work and people's position in a company is very important to them personally and to their family and friends. And so the idea of working hard is really an expression of sort of how important that is to them in many cases, and how they view coworkers as family. And so they're not just working hard to work hard, but really to support their coworkers, support their colleagues who are like family members to them. And so that was really, really interesting just to see how people functioned in an office environment. And I think the second thing I learned was really in Japan, and that was very interesting to me, was the style of communication across an office, where people I worked with in Japan were somewhat reserved, and there's a whole culture of, and a word for it in Japan called nommunication, which is basically means a casual form of communication. And so in Japan, the way you get to know your colleagues and the way you get a lot of work done actually is by not interacting in the office, but by doing things outside of the office, going out to dinner, going out to lunch, going out for drinks, and just generally socializing with each other to have a more casual environment, a safer place to kind of express who you are and what you feel about what's going on at the company. So I share those stories just to give you a sense of how different each of these experiences was, and how much I learned along the way, and continue to learn as I come back from Japan recently. So I appreciate some of the comments. We've got somebody who actually went to Stuttgart, Germany as well. So I was in Essen, Germany, which isn't too close to Stuttgart, but a fascinating place to be. So to kind of wrap that up, I think the three things that I've learned that have been most critical to my experience and my success as I've gone to different assignments around the world. Number one, to keep an open mind. and to seek to understand other people and other cultures. And as I've shared, every place is different. And what's been really important to me is to try to understand what's motivating people in each of these cultures. Motivations are different. And in the United States, we might be motivated by wanting to be friends with our coworkers. We might be motivated by wanting to grow a business as quickly as possible. We might be motivated by wanting to earn as much money as we can, as much profit as we can in the business. We could be motivated by many, many things. But those are all different as you move from country to country. And so it's really important to understand what is the motivation that is causing people to do what they do, and how is that different from what I'm doing. Second is that communication is very, very critical, including language and culture. Communication isn't just talking. It can be done in a lot of different ways. I mentioned communication in Japan, very casual way of communicating with coworkers. It could be having a meal with somebody. It could be going to a sporting event. There are a lot of different ways that you can get to know a culture and really communicate with people as you go from place to place. And then third is really relationships. And what's been most helpful for me as I've gone through my career is not really developing my technical skills and understanding finance and understanding accounting, but it's more about people and relationships. Communication is a big part of that, but also just, as I said, keeping an open mind, understanding people in different cultures. And you never know when you're out and about how somebody in a relationship is going to come back and be fruitful, 5 years later, 10 years later. And so building those relationships with people in different countries has been incredibly valuable to me personally and also to my career. So I'm going to pause here for a second and just ask a question. Time for a pop quiz based on what I've been sharing for the last 20 minutes or so. So the question is, and if you're wanting to, you can put your answers into the chat box. What skill was most helpful to my career as a CFO in Japan? Was it A, understanding Japanese banking rules? B, speaking kindergarten level Japanese? C, willingness to try a wide variety of sushi? Or D, my fearlessness when singing karaoke? Lance answers C. That's pretty close. And actually, it's D. It's fearlessness when singing karaoke. And I know Alyssa, who's on the call as well, can attest to this. Actually, these are kind of in reverse order. So I'd say the answer is D, C, B, A. And again, in Japan and as I've gone around internationally, it's not really about my technical skills. It's more about being able to communicate and relate with people in the countries I'm working in. I think in Japan, there's another word, another Japanese word, which is doryoku, which means showing your spirit. And singing karaoke in Japan is a very fun experience because of this concept of doryoku, which is show your spirit. And what that means to me, or what I saw, is that in the United States, if you go to sing karaoke, people are sort of embarrassed about how they look or how their voice is. And a lot of people would not sing just because it's kind of like public speaking. It's very difficult and it's a lot of risk. In Japan, people sort of use this concept of doryoku, which is just show your spirit, and it's okay. It's okay if your voice isn't good. It's okay if you look like a fool. That's actually part of the experience, and so karaoke has been a great way to, again, just get to know people in a very, very casual environment. Andrea is asking me on the chat, what's my go-to karaoke song? If I can do a duet, I like to sing some songs from Greece, some John Travolta, and then I give Adele a try once in a while, which is a little bit of a shock to most people when I get up and try to sing Adele songs. So again, it's not about the voice, it's not about the skill, but it's really just about showing your spirit and having a good time with your colleagues. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about Starbucks and a little bit on the business side. So the question here is, why do companies go international? And I think the answer is obvious here. It's D, all of the above, plus many more. But for Starbucks and for many countries, many companies, there are many reasons to seek out international business. And at Starbucks, we've kind of done all three of these. I'll talk a little bit about them. Number one is to grow with new customers and markets. B is to find new products and supply chains. At Starbucks, we buy a lot of coffee, obviously, and coffee doesn't come from the United States. It comes from countries around the equator, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And so we need to have people in those countries finding the highest quality coffee they can find. And so we have a large international business around coffee. We also buy a lot of furniture, believe it or not. We buy a lot of furniture for our stores. And so we have a very active group that's out trying to figure out where's the best place I can buy high quality furniture and meet my business goals and my social goals as well. And so we have a lot of folks in our supply chain who are out trying to find those products. And then C, to protect their brand and business. And at Starbucks, we grew very quickly throughout the 90s and sort of tried to establish a Seattle coffee culture around the United States and many other countries. And what we saw back then was that we had a lot of copycat competitors who looked at Starbucks in the US and they said, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to try to open something like that in the UK, or I'm going to try to open something like that in China. And so for Starbucks, we went on a binge to really open our stores in as many countries as we could to protect our brand and to not fall behind other coffee competitors. And so let me get into what Starbucks international business looks like a little bit. Here you can see a map of where our stores are around the world. Today we're in 81 markets around the world, and we have over 17,000 stores. And this does not include the US, so all of these outside of the United States. The color on the map represents the ownership structure that we use in those markets. And so what that means is as Starbucks expanded really quickly and continues to expand really quickly, we don't necessarily go and own all of the stores that we operate around the world. We use a number of different business structures to do that. In countries like Canada and China, we actually own the stores that we operate there 100%. You can see those are in green. In many markets in Europe and South America, as you can see on the map, we own 0% of our stores. We have what's called a licensing agreement, where we work with a local business partner to operate our stores under a license from the Starbucks brand. And so other companies actually operate those stores, and we have a business relationship with them to supply them coffee and other products that you see at Starbucks. And then in a couple countries, notably India, we have a 50-50 joint venture. And we partner again with a local company, in this case with Tata, which is a very large Indian company, and we form a 50-50 joint venture to develop Starbucks stores in those countries. And so we have a couple of those kinds of businesses as well in India and South Korea. In terms of Starbucks growth, the reason that we are growing aggressively internationally, you can see on this slide, which is our global store growth goals. And so when we say unit growth, we mean store growth. And so globally, what Starbucks is trying to do is grow our store count 6 to 7%. The issue is that in the US, we can grow about 3 to 4%. So in the United States, we're opening about 500 stores per year, which is about 3 to 4% growth. And so in order to hit that global growth goal, we need to find new markets that are growing more quickly than the US. For Starbucks, the biggest market that fits that description has been China over the last few years. And I talked about China earlier, where we're growing our store count by roughly 15% per year, opening approximately 500 stores in China as well, which leads to a higher growth rate there on a low store base. And like I mentioned, we've been able to go from 200 stores in China to over 4,000 in the last 10 to 12 years or so. And so it's been a great source of just overall business growth and store growth for us at Starbucks. So how do we do that? Let me talk a little bit about a concept that's very important at Starbucks, which is local relevance. And on this slide, you can see how that shows up in our stores. We have a lot of great designers and a lot of great people that work in fields like architecture and real estate. And so it's very important to us as we go around the world to build stores that don't all look alike. They look very different, and they're very relevant to the local country or local community that we're doing business in. A couple examples here. You can see a store in Japan on the lower left. On the upper left is a store in Milan, Italy, our roastery that we opened a couple years ago in the former post office in the middle of Milan. In the upper middle box is a store by a famous architect in Japan. His name is Kengo Kuma. And then in the upper right is the Pink Starbucks, a beautiful store in Turks and Caicos in the Caribbean, and one that we're really proud of how that looks and how it fits into the local community and culture. So you won't see those stores everywhere. You won't see many or any really that look like this in the United States, but we do go to great lengths to make sure our stores show up and are very locally relevant to the community. Okay, next I have another quick question, and you can put your answer into the chat box. And I'll tell you that the picture that's in here won't help you with your answer. So the question is, what is the most popular Starbucks drink in Japan? Is it A, pumpkin spice latte, B, mango dragon fruit refresher, C, nitro cold brew with sweet cream, one of my favorites, or D, the strawberry frappuccino? Okay, so we've got a couple answers here. We've got D. We've got somebody who says pumpkin spice latte, a couple of B's, actually a lot of B's. And actually the answer is D, it's the strawberry frappuccino. And if you were in Japan today, you could actually pick up a strawberry frappuccino. We just launched that promotion a couple days ago. And so, you know, all of these products are fairly popular in the US. I think as we look at the landscape of drinks in the US, pumpkin spice latte is one that a lot of our customers really like when it comes out in the fall. It's very popular. But I'll tell you that in Japan and most countries in Asia, we don't even serve the pumpkin spice latte. When you say the word pumpkin and the flavor of pumpkin in many Asian countries, it doesn't resonate with customers. And their first reaction to the flavor of pumpkin is sort of ugh, it doesn't sound very good. And so we don't sell a lot of pumpkin spice latte. But we do sell a lot of strawberry frappuccino, and that's by far the most popular drink we have in Japan over the last couple of years. Another interesting piece story on this slide is the mango dragon fruit refresher, which is now very popular in the U.S. You know, the flavor dragon fruit is one that a few years ago you wouldn't really have seen that on the radar in the U.S. And it's a fruit that's readily available in Asia, and I think a flavor that we brought back from our Asian markets, and now we've been able to bring some of our products from Asia into the US, and they proved very popular. The photo here is of matcha green tea, matcha frappuccino, matcha latte, green tea latte, another flavor that was developed in Japan many years ago, which is now very popular in the US. So for us, it's been very interesting on the journey to discover flavors that are very relevant in our markets around the world and bring those back to customers in the US. So I've got a couple comments on pumpkin spice latte. They're missing out. Yes, I agree. I like the pumpkin spice latte as well. It's one of my favorites. And then can it be offered later as a creamer in the channel marketing avenue? That's a great suggestion from Holly, and I'll take a look at that. I'm sure it's something that we're thinking about for the fall season, but let me check on that one. So just continuing with a couple of photos of some of my other favorite products, and I think these are all beverages that you will only see outside of the U.S. But some of the more interesting ones that we've done throughout the years on the Frappuccino side of the business. Fresh banana. We did a Frappuccino where we put a fresh banana in it and blended it into the beverage. Cantaloupe melon and cream, I should say. I don't think we've ever had cantaloupe in the U.S., but that was a good one. And then on the upper right, we tried what we called American cherry pie Frappuccino, and we actually put a pie crust on top of the drink so that it had the real look and texture of a cherry pie, and that was in Japan as well. I'll say that one didn't do too well because people were very confused by how to drink it, how to get the straw through the pie crust, and what were they supposed to do with the pie crust. But it's very interesting to see a lot of the different drinks that we try internationally, and some work and some don't. But it's very, very cool to see those come back and forth between our different markets. So that's about it for my overview of Starbucks international business, and I'll kind of shift back to those of you in the audience. I think so. If you're wondering, hey, I really want to work in international business. I want to have an international career. What are some things that you can do today? And I think I've shared a few of those. But first is to start to develop a global mindset. And for me, that didn't really happen, as I mentioned, until I was in high school and college and started to explore the world a little bit more. But today, in today's world, there are many things available to help you do that. Some of my favorite newspapers and magazines are The Economist, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. It's very easy to develop a global mindset just by reading and trying to understand a little bit more about what's going on in the world, and also in the business world around the world. Number two is travel and get outside of your comfort zone a little bit. I found that I've grown the most when I've done things like live with a family on a coffee farm for a couple of weeks, or move with my family to a different country for a couple of years. It's not always the most comfortable thing to do, but it's a very good way to grow and just experience what life is like outside of your hometown. Third is learn a foreign language. I know probably most of you are studying a foreign language. I know when I was in high school, I sort of took a language just because it was a requirement without really thinking about the long-term ramifications. But for me, as I mentioned, just knowing a little bit of the German language was really, really helpful for me in starting my career in international business. And then finally, make an effort to meet new and interesting people. And again, I talked about relationships. And for me, that's been one of the most rewarding parts of working internationally is just the number of really interesting and different people that you meet, and how I've formed some lifelong friendships with people I've worked with and spent time with as I've lived in other countries. And so finally, I want to just leave you with a couple of inspirational quotes that I've heard. One of them is very recent, but on the left is a quote from Mark Twain, author of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, famous American writer. And I'll just read it. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all of one's lifetime. And I really have taken inspiration from that, just in how travel has really opened my eyes to different cultures, different people, and really, helped me grow as a person and had a lot of rewards. And then on the right is a quote that's very recent from one of my all-time favorite basketball players, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was the LeBron James of the 1980s when I was in high school, and is the NBA's all-time leading scorer. And recently, in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the issues of racial discrimination in the U.S., he's come out with a couple of very, I think, inspirational thoughts that I have learned a lot from. One of those was very simple. just go out and make a friend of someone who doesn't look like us. And as I heard him talk about that, just realized that for me, that's been a very educational and a very inspirational part of my international experience, is meeting a lot of people that are very different from me and very interesting. So I will leave it with that. And I think at this point, Andrea, we can take any questions or comments from the audience.
All right, sounds good. I've got a couple here already. So those of you who are watching, if you'd like to type questions in the participant chat or the Q&A, we will make sure that Dave can answer those. And so first off, we have from Douglas Farnell, we have, with multiple questions surrounding globalization, is Starbucks considering making any changes?
Multiple questions surrounding globalization. I'm not sure I understand the multiple questions around globalization.
Maybe Doug can help us out. I do have another question.
Okay. Yeah, Doug, if you could clarify that, that would be very helpful while we do another question.
Awesome. So do you have recommendations from high school and college graduates trying to find a job in the post-COVID environment?
Yeah, I think this is a obviously very unique time in the history of the business world, the history of the United States, the history of any of us. And my advice is just to keep on trying and keep at it. And one simple word is perseverance. It's not easy, I'm sure, to be graduating, looking for work now. I know when I got out of school, shortly after that, we went into a recession as well. This is a number of years ago, but I know the feeling of trying to find a role as you come out of college or high school in this kind of economy. So my only advice is to keep persevering. Keep meeting people, as many people as you can, and try to find roles in non-traditional ways. I've mentioned a lot about relationships, but many roles and jobs come from relationships more than they do from filling out job applications. So keep persevering and just try to pull out all the stops as you're looking for roles.
So Janet would really like to know if the land layout on the slide was real.
Oh, yes. Sorry, Janet. I saw that question earlier. I don't think that's real, actually, but it's a cool picture. But I don't know the story behind that picture. But it looks like it's probably not real. But it's a cool photo nonetheless.
And let's see. Catherine would like to know, how do you see international business changing after COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Starbucks actually today we put out some public documents around the impact of COVID-19 on our business, and it's been very impactful for us and for many industries, but in particular retail and food service, I think, have been very heavily impacted, and that's where Starbucks store business sits. And so I think what you're going to see is a lot of innovation and a lot of new ways of going to market, I'll call it. So at Starbucks, we are going to accelerate a lot of development that we have in progress around to-go stores and around stores that don't necessarily focus on people coming in and enjoying a cafe experience, but maybe a to-go experience or a mobile order experience where they're looking for something quickly and conveniently. And so in the retail and food service space, we're seeing, and I think we'll continue to see, significant shifts toward how do we get our products to our customers in a very convenient way, as opposed to the traditional method, which is, a customer comes to a shopping mall or comes to a grocery store. I think you're going to see an acceleration of some of those digital ordering and digital delivery methods that have been developing for a number of years, but I think this will be a tipping point to accelerate those even more. And we're definitely seeing that at Starbucks.
I think this is along the line too from Doug Furnell, following up on that question that he had. Per The Economist, globalization has recently come under attack and may experience forces trying to shrink supply chains closer to the US. So I think the question is more about the supply chains.
Yes, okay, that's I understand. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I think lots of questions recently with COVID. And questions, frankly, that have been around longer than COVID around global supply chains. And I think the idea, especially in U.S. companies, that we have built supply chains that have been built for efficiency. I talked about Starbucks sourcing coffee, sourcing furniture, and many other products internationally. And I think a typical approach to supply chain and sourcing those kinds of products involves efficiency. How do I find things that are, things my customers want, but also are at a good price and a good value for my business that help me meet my business objectives? Recently with COVID, there's been a lot of discussion around supply chains that may be focused on different things. It could be around sustainability. It could be around, working through business disruptions like COVID. If you have your supply chains closer to home, it may be easier to find those products, when there is some sort of business disruption, whether it's a health pandemic or a natural disaster or whatever that might be. So, I think to answer your question, Doug, specifically about Starbucks, we have kind of a long tradition of trying to balance out our supply chain across many different angles. So, one is efficiency, but there's also an angle around doing good for our communities and being a socially responsible company. We have high standards in terms of our mission and values. And as an example, we have a program called Cafe Practices, which provides equity for coffee farmers. We typically pay a little higher price than market rates for coffee in an effort to make sure that our coffee farmers have a sustainable lifestyle. That's one example on the social spectrum. And then I think in terms of global supply, we also are balancing out global efficiency with local sourcing. So, just a general consumer trend, as I'm sure you know, is a move toward wanting to buy things that are locally produced. And that's a very important thing for our customers and very important for our business. And so we are always looking at that as well. In Japan, for example, we offer a lot of products in our stores that are made by local craftsmen and artisans, which is very important in Japanese culture. They take great pride in the quality of craftsmanship. And so we may offer cups and mugs or different products in our stores that really highlight that local craftsmanship. So I think, that's a few examples, but it's a good point. It's always a balance of trying to balance all those different factors.
All right, it looks like I have one more question here in the chat and question and answer. So if you've got a burning question that you have not asked yet, please get those in. So what Tanvir wants to know, what extracurricular, internship classes, etc., do you recommend high schoolers should take if they are interested in making a business?
Yeah, Tanvir, that's a great question. I think there's a couple things. Again, as I compare my experience, which is now very, very dated, but I do a lot of recruiting of students who are looking to come to work at Starbucks, and there's a couple things that I noticed that are very different from when I was growing up that I would encourage you to take advantage of. Number one is just the focus on entrepreneurship, and whether you're in high school or at the University of Washington, they now have an amazing focused program on entrepreneurship. And so I think number one, I would encourage you to take as many classes or extracurricular activities around entrepreneurship and just learning kind of what it takes and the basics about building your own business. And whether you do start your own business or whether you work for a large corporation like I do, those skills will always be very, very helpful. And then the second one is, something I've talked about a lot today is just global business knowledge and global viewpoints. And there are, I think, many more than I remember, many more international programs available to students, whether it's study abroad in college for a semester or even things like trips that are sponsored by local churches or local community groups, where you can take a more active approach to travel and learn and do something along the way. I would really encourage you to take advantage of those kinds of opportunities as well. So those are kind of two areas that I see in today's students and recruits that are very, very impressive, and that I place a lot of value in when I'm talking to them.
All right, seeing no more questions, I want to thank Dave and Alyssa for joining us today with our speaker series. We learned so much. Thank you so much for joining us. The conversation went into a great segue of Washington Business Week. So I want to remind you to sign up for Washington Business Week. We have our upcoming first camp, a virtual camp starting on June 22nd. We'll then have camps in July and August. That August camp will be more focused on an international experience, as we have 2 cities from Poland that are signing on, and will be sending 35 plus Polish students, so a real international feel to that virtual program. Next year, you can also go to Poland as a student for Washington Business Week if you would like. We've got 3 different programs there in Poland. So next week is the culmination of our speaker series. We are going to end this with Brenda Morris, who is a past board member of Washington Business Week. She serves on many amazing high-profile boards and is a leader in communication. So her background is with the Duluth Trading Company, Boot Barn, and many others. She's going to be talking about transformational leadership and outstanding communication and presentation skills as you design your best life. So I hope that you will join us next week and join us for camp. So again, thank you guys for spending time with us, and we hopefully will see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.